Rob Gould. Welcome. I'm Rob Gould. I teach in the Department of Statistics at UCLA, so it's, I know that there are very few departments of statistics around the country, but we're in one of them, and so I have a rather biased point of view about statistics, and I'm really happy, I think, to share my biases with you today. One thing I wanted to talk about was this idea of how to teach data literacy, which goes by many names now. I just heard a new one the other day, data fluency. I think they're all the same thing, that basically means understanding how to work with data. And I made a list in my mind, and it got really, really long, so I narrowed it down to just 8 things. 8 is still pretty long. 7 would have been a better number, but I'll show you the list in a minute, and we can emphasize just a few of those things. When I started to think about this talk, I started thinking like, well, what do students think about statistics? And I've definitely heard my students' opinions from time to time. One was early on when I went to the dentist and they had a new hygienist, and just as he's coming at me with those sharp-pointed things, he says, "I know you. You're my stats teacher." So I put things up so that I won't put any of them on the spot, but they're number sort of words that come up at the end. And if someone asks you, what do you do for a living, and you say, I teach statistics, you tend to get this look of horror on their face. So why is this a bad thing? What do we want to have them say? We want to have them say more, please. We want them to want more of that and not less. And there's a lot of reasons why it's good to pay attention to attitudes. There's research that shows that negative attitudes about a subject impede the learning, and positive attitudes help. There's some literature that people who come in believing that they can't learn, in fact, end up not liking what they're not learning. And if they believe they can learn, sometimes that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, what can we do to kind of get students' attitudes to change? And like I said, just 8 simple steps. And I'm going to go through them kind of one by one, of course, in the talk. I hope we have time for all 8, but I want to focus really on 4 important ones, kind of if we take home nothing else. And I'll also see how to distribute these slides. I'm sure there's a way to do that. I may have to remove some of the non-copyrighted photos, but the data cycle, I'll tell you what that means. It's a tool for teaching that I think is really helpful, and then using real data. So there are really 3 kind of gold star items in this list that I want to focus on. I just want to say a little bit about what's influenced me, and there's kind of 3 things. One is, if you haven't seen the guidelines for assessment, and it's a horrible name, a horribly long acronym, the GAZE thing. This comes from the American Statistical Association. It was first published in 2005, and now it's been updated more recently. And they give this has been kind of like one of the things that's influenced my teaching. It's kind of more influences the what to the how. It's a nice document. And then there are 2 experiences I've had on my own. One is running the DataFest competition for 10 years now, and I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. And that's certainly kind of given me a lot of experiences and understandings into how students think of this topic that I wouldn't otherwise have. The other one is kind of unusual. It's a project I've been a part of that's created a high school data science course, which is actually kind of like a pre-stats course that's meant to be taken like around for sophomores and juniors in high school. And I've learned a lot from watching high school teachers and high school students learn data analysis and data literacy and all. So those are the ideas that kind of fuse everything. But I think maybe the most important thing in this talk, if you learn nothing else, of course we all have our passionate subjects, and mine is statistics, so that's one of my biases. But I think it's a really, really important thing to learn. And I think it's really important our students understand that it's important to learn. So why is it important to learn? If you tell this to a student, what are they going to care about? Jobs. The good news is there are jobs. The American Statistical Association a couple years back funded a report, and you can kind of look at the findings here, but basic take-home message, there's a tremendous demand for people with degrees in statistics and data-related fields, but also just for very basic skills. That message kind of, almost 60% of businesses were just looking for people who had better basic skills. So we're not talking about degrees in statistics, we're talking about the intro stats course. Businesses are looking for people who are strong on the things that happen in the intro stats course. Tableau did another study of their own, and the only thing, there are many things you can read the report, but I want to just highlight this interesting quote, that students who study statistics go on to have careers as, and there's a long list there that touches almost every field of commerce, and then they left fields out as well. So I think in some sense statistics has become the liberal arts of the sciences. It gives you entryway, it gives students entryway into many different disciplines, so they don't have to make up their mind now. That's another nice take-home message. So jobs are in demand, jobs are varied and cater to a variety of different student interests and backgrounds. So as part of the motivation, I also have 4 parables. I used to have 3 and I've added a fourth, that kind of emphasize the importance of data literacy today. So the first is a quiz that I'm going to ask you. If you know the answer, just keep your hand down, or I guess you can give the answer. I don't want. So imagine that I knew 3 things about everyone in the country. What percentage of people in the country could I uniquely identify? In other words, what percentage of people in the country don't share those 3 things? Okay, so, as a show of hands, and you have to vote, how many say 0 to 10% of the country could be identified? 10 to 20. 20 to 30. 30 to 40. 40 to 50. 50 to 60, 60 to 70, this is where the cynics come out, 70 to 80, 80 to 90.
I need to reverse my vote.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Oh, you want to, yeah, so to make it clear, these are the percentages we uniquely identify. So 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 100. Okay, so there are some cynics in here. Good, I'm in comfortable, good company. So in 2010, when she did her research, it was 87%.
Hey,
right? So it's kind of shocking that 3 pieces of information you're likely to share with no one else. And if you're wondering, you can go to her website. She has this great data privacy lab, and you can type in these bits of information. And I myself am unique in this country at that point in time. And I guess it's unlikely to change unless someone moves in the right code. So, let's do parable 1. Parable 2 is a story that was reported pretty widely in several, I guess well, I'll show you where in a minute, I just forgot. I'm getting this example from the National Academy of Sciences webinar on data science, and they had one on ethics of data, and you can stream it yourself now anytime. It's a really interesting discussion. So this is not something I came across myself, but comes from Professor Brittany Fiore-Garland at the University of Washington. Basic idea is, I'm sure you know what Amazon Prime is. You pay an annual fee and you get some perks. A few years ago, Amazon, one of those perks it was going to offer was same-day delivery, which now they pretty much offer everywhere on some products. But like all good companies, they didn't want to roll it out to the whole country at the same time. They wanted to kind of test drive it first. So they had to choose which neighborhoods they would roll it out in. So they had chosen 6 cities, and they wanted to narrow down within those cities which neighborhoods. So you can see unbiased is in quotes there. It's setting us up for something. And the idea here was that they were going to use an algorithm that would be unbiased. And what it means is, with respect to race, would choose which neighborhoods got to be the lucky neighborhoods to spend more money on Amazon and get same-day delivery. They looked at things that are not racially motivated. Percent of members in the neighborhood who were prime members, how close the neighborhoods were to distribution centers and things like that. Nonetheless, as soon as they announced what the neighborhoods were, Bloomberg noticed really quickly that the neighborhoods that were excluded were African American neighborhoods. And a day or two later, some reporters found out that in fact those neighborhoods almost perfectly followed the historic redlining boundaries. And so Amazon retracted and kind of just rolled it out to all the neighborhoods as soon as this came out. But I mean that when I don't know if she uses this term in her talk, but when I read into it, that someone used the term of palimpsest. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but a palimpsest is a document where someone has written on it and other people have written or painted over it, but if you scratch, you can kind of see what's underneath. And they use that here. It's like, there's this neutral algorithm, but it scratches a little bit and it exposes the biases that are kind of built in underneath that veneer. So that's parable number 2. Third is the target story. So this again was also widely reported in the press, and you may have heard of it. Forbes is one of the news agencies that reported it. And the basic idea here was a 16-year-old girl started to get coupons from Target that assumed she was pregnant. And the father and parents were, of course, outraged until they discovered she was in fact pregnant. I don't know. They probably were still outraged. But the direction of their rage shifted. And this led to a big, how did Target know? I will say as a statistician, we didn't know about all the people who got coupons incorrectly, but in this case it was correct. And so the reporters interviewed a Target statistician and said that they've identified 25 products they use that produces a pregnancy score. And as a hypothetical, if a female buys a blue rug, hand cream, vitamins, and a blue bag, she has an 87% chance of being pregnant. Perfectly logical. So eventually she gets coupons. So, and I mean, you think about all of the variables that are being processed. I mean, out of the tens of thousands of things that people can buy, there's some number crunching going on there that finds 25 of them and makes, these judgments.
So what's the cause and effect there?
The cause and effect is if it thinks you're pregnant, you get coupons. I don't know if they did studies to see how accurate their predictions
So
were.
coupons are not the culprit.
They're not causing the pregnancy. That's probably what the girl said. We shouldn't make light of it. This is a serious topic. So that's the scary stuff, and there's lots more scary stuff. I mean, yesterday or 2 days ago, the New York Times ran an article that found that the databases that Google and other people are using to train facial recognition software uses pictures of children, and these pictures have been culled from Flickr websites that parents posted, and many of them did not, so they posted pictures of their kids to share with friends, and now they're being used as test subjects. Their pictures are, not the children. But that's alarming in itself. A New York Times reporter set up a $100 piece of software and a camera in front of the plaza in front of the New York Times building, and after a few days was able to identify by name people who passed by. So there's a lot going on here. This is that famous Strava thing where it's a fitness tracker that you use to track your running routes and exercise routes, and people were able to figure out where secret military bases were based on looking at people's tracks, and someone was able to stalk. A woman was stalked by someone who used her tracks. If you're interested, this is not only one of the best book titles I've ever come across, but it's a great book that's very accessible to your students. And one nice thing about it is, unlike what I've just done is give you many tales of woe, she has very constructive steps that people can take to kind of help minimize these and protect themselves against some potential harms. So I told you 3 scary things. I want to tell you one positive thing. I came across this several years ago, and it's a good example, so I keep using it. And it was a blog called Diary of a Pizza Girl. She worked for a pizza place in Austin, Texas. Came to my attention because she kept data on her blog. And specifically, Here's just an example of what the data looked like. But one day she posted a question, and the scenario of this question was, she gets paid an hourly rate, but if there's a call for a delivery, she has to clock out, and the money she makes is whatever she gets in tips while she's on call. So she's senior enough that she gets to decide whether she goes on the delivery or someone else does. So she wants to know, is it worth her while to take a call, to go on delivery? So she ponders about what data she might collect that would help with this, and comes upon the idea of method of payment, because when people call in, they say, how do you plan to pay? And maybe that helps predict it. So she assembled this data, and she made some pie charts, and they weren't terribly compelling, and they didn't help her very much, and she kind of asked for help. So enter the picture of one of her readers on her blog. It was a statistician named Jared Lander. He had coincidentally just written his master's thesis on New York pizzas. So to the best of my knowledge, these two have never met, but it would be great if they met and fell in love and would write a screenplay. But it didn't work out quite that way. Like I said, I don't know if they've ever met. I don't know either of the two people. But he took her data and he ran it through what some of you will maybe recognize as some nice ggplot graphics, produced some box plots based upon the payment method. And she looked at these and quickly came to the conclusion that not only do people who pay cash tend to tip better, but there's not much deviation there. You can be pretty certain that the tips are going to fall in a fairly small range. The prepaid people are kind of all over the map. These people you don't want to talk to, but the cash people seem like it would maybe be worth her while to go out. And not only worth her while, but because of the small standard deviation, she kind of knows how much she's going to make. So that's kind of a positive story, and I find it, I'll say a little bit more about that. I find it really interesting because when we're teaching stats students, we probably don't have ambitions in mind for them to become pizza delivery people. Some of them are, and we may even be thinking, this class may not be for you, but in fact it is. And the other, back to the jobs that are looking for basic skills, it's not that she had tremendously sophisticated analytic skills, but she knew quite a bit. She knew the importance of data, she knew how to share it, and she knew how to make sense of it when someone else did the analysis for her. So that much was enough to help her. So the basic morals here, and that help us understand why data literacy is so important, one is that they can undermine our privacy, and it's kind of breaking traditional boundaries of what it means to have confidences shared between people and things. There's a positive side that it can empower if we know something about it. And then there's the negative side of that they can propagate patterns of inequity. And the solution to not propagating these patterns is, of course, to educate people so that when they join these, only a small percentage of them will become, Silicon Valley tech people, but we have to reach everyone to get to that small percentage, and we can outrage more. So the steps, and back to the 8 steps. So the first one I'm referring to as a secret learning outcome, and I'm doing that because it's extraordinarily hard to achieve. So I don't necessarily want my students to know about it, but also because I'm not going to assess it. This is something that's an outcome for me, and it's basically this, that what I want them to do is discover something about the real world using statistics. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that they'll read a homework problem that teaches them something about the real world they didn't know. I mean that they'll actually discover something on their own. And I was inspired by this, I wish I could remember his name, but someone from the US Census came out and gave us a seminar a while back and pointed out that high school students all the time make discoveries in the census data that no one knew. That it's uncovered, it's such vast data. There's so many questions that could be asked, and so many that haven't yet been asked, that it's a place where people without too much experience can make real headway. So this is my secret learning outcome, and I say this because we have so many outcomes in our stats courses. There are the basic learning outcomes, some of which are thrust upon us. There are others that we've chosen, and then there's kind of the institutional outcomes that, the stats course is going to help students get through their math unit faster. It's going to help them transfer better, it's going to get them, all these sorts of things it's meant to do depending on, and those are all fine and good, but the real reason for learning statistics is to learn something about the world. And I want to kind of, like I said, I'm afraid to share that with them because they'll judge me horribly, like I'm judging them, but that's something that's my internal goal for the course. I'll say at the end, and I'll say it now, I don't achieve this. I try, but I haven't completely succeeded. Nonetheless, the remaining steps are attempts to kind of move in that direction. And the second is to expand what it means to do statistics. So this goes to the idea of building students' confidences that they can succeed and they can do statistics. Not so much about passing a test or anything, it's about understanding how data are used in the world. And so that means kind of maybe changing or adding topics to the curriculum. And a really basic one, I don't know if you guys have seen this, the what's going on in this graph feature. Yeah, so the New York Times releases one of these every other week. And they take an old graph, not too old, the current, but from a previous issue, and they strip some of the context and ask students and people, they ask them 3 questions. Let's go to the next slide, which has the questions on it. What do you notice? What do you wonder? And what's going on? Write a headline that catches the essence of this graph. So what do you notice and what do you wonder turn out to be incredibly powerful prompts that get over the whole sort of thing of what am I supposed to notice, what am I supposed to say. It's about what does the student notice and what does the student wonder about. If we had more time, I'd give us some time to look at this. But you get the idea. I'm going to come back to those 2 prompts again in a few minutes. The nice thing about this feature is students now, as citizens, are expected to interpret all sorts of graphics. And math teaches them a lot of graphics. But a lot of the graphics that they're now, all of us now, are being confronted with are not often covered in a math course. This actually is. This one is actually a nice time series plot and all the things they've learned about XY planes and functions and things they can kind of, it should look kind of familiar to them if they have that background. But here's another example of one they featured that isn't something you've seen in a math class. And it's got lots of different variables that it's considering. You have to spend some time trying to understand what the story here is. So there's a lot to parse out. Those basic questions of I notice and I wonder are rather simplistic. They're a nice conversation starter for the first couple of weeks of class. But if you want to go a little deeper after a few weeks, you can ask students like, what variables do you see represented here? What do you think the observations were? How would you have organized these data so that you could have presented a chart like this? And that last one about organizing the data is really tough. It takes quite a bit of things to work out and quite a bit of sophistication. So it's possible to go deeper with this question as the term progresses. I should say if you have questions, please interrupt me. Otherwise, I just go on. Another really fun activity that I owe to a couple of colleagues is to ask students to keep a data diary for one day. This is actually a fun thing for everyone to do. And the basic idea is for 24 hours, you're going to record every instance in which someone or something collects data about you. And at the end of those 24 hours, you can look it over and wonder, what might someone learn about me if they knew all of these? I mean, because you've got little bits of information that are going into different bins. So for example, you walk past a security camera, and perhaps it has facial recognition software, and perhaps it knows who you are. That's stored in one location. Then you go to the ATM, and there's some data stored about your transaction there. What if those two spoke to each other? What sort of story could come out of that activity? And is it a story you want shared? Hopefully it is, but it may not be. And the last one on this topic, I don't know if you're aware of these books either, but these are really fantastic books. Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Posavec are, they're graphic artists who specialize in statistical graphics. And they live in different continents, and they met somewhere, and they made a promise that each week they would choose a theme to collect data on, and they would write a postcard that illustrated the data they had collected and send it to each other. And this book consists of every postcard for the week, for the year that they sent to each other. And I'll show you an example in a second. This book tells you how you can do that, or how your students can do that, and offers some kind of step-by-step scaffolding so that anyone can kind of carry out an experiment like this. I'll just show you one example. This is a graphic about a week of complaints and general grumpiness. And so the one end of the postcard has the graphic, and then the other end has the legend that helps you to interpret it. So the colors represent types of complaint: weather, husband, families, animals, society, the world in general, and so on. So they make a big deal about how some of this is just almost like an act of meditation. It's a kind of sense of being knowing and mindful of what's happening to you in some amount of time. But what's also great about it is it fosters and invites a lot of creativity. We're not just saying, go to the software and produce a histogram that, blah, blah, blah. You're allowed to kind of go your own way. Now, some students will hate that. I'll probably be one of them, because nothing I drew would ever come out looking like that. But others will find it really interesting, and so it's a whole new venue that helps them explore the relationship between data and their lives and representations of that data. So some kind of sophisticated. I call the data cycle. It's really called this in the GAZE outlines I told you before, guidelines. It's called the statistical investigation cycle, but I think data cycle is much catchier. This is kind of what we use for our high school kids, and I started to use it in all of my classes with college students. If you're familiar with the MAAs, or I can't remember if the MAA or the NCTM, their mathematical modeling graphic about what the mathematical modeling cycle is, it's very, very close to that. It's the same idea. There's a topic around here, and we investigate in different stages. The graphic kind of implies that there's a right direction and a wrong direction. That's not really true. You're allowed to kind of move all over the place. But it's really helpful to point out to students and ask them to reflect on which stage that they're in at any given time as a way of helping them see what the next steps may be. So if they're, stuck understanding the data, you can say, well, your goal is, you want to do an analysis. So what sort of things do we need to understand here to move to here? I would say traditionally, in a stats class, about 80% of the effort is spent here, and maybe 15% here. How much am I up to? 80, 95, and 5% here. And you can think about what in your own class where you distribute. I'll tell you what I think is the most important, and that's to ask questions. It's surprising how hard it is to ask questions, and we often assume curiosity is an innate skill, but in fact it needs to be taught, specifically in the context of data. There's a great research dissertation by Pip Arnold from the University of Auckland, who really investigated how students think and develop questions. And in here she offers a rubric that really helps students kind of tune their questions from vague, general, maybe not so good questions into really precise questions. This is also extremely important scientifically, because there's a lot of bad statistics out there that comes when the question is imposed upon the conclusion and goes in the wrong order. So questions are meant to come first. I should say there are many cases when the data comes first and we have to look at the data to understand what questions we could ask. But the questions are the pivotal piece of that cycle. I'm going to give us a little chance to develop that further in just a minute, because I also want to talk about step number 4, which is to use real data. So, and I'll add to this, use real data, particularly data about people, and I'll show you an example, but the idea here is all of us like to see ourselves in something, and when you're first beginning to do data analysis, it really helps if you understand the context. And we have experiences with people, for better or worse, that helps give us a context, that helps us generate questions that we could ask of the data. We're swimming in data. It's everywhere now. Southern California is particularly good about providing lots of data, although it's not good everywhere. So you can just Google the phrase open data with some institution and often find really interesting data sets. I said Googled open data in Newport Beach and I did not find interesting data. So I got to the Orange County website from there, which looks promising because it has an interesting graph that's almost too good to be true. But then all the data is about the budget and their documents. So a lot of government agencies think that documents are data, and I guess in an abstract sense they are, but there's not so much we can do with PDF files. But other cities, in LA County, LA City, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, San Francisco, San Mateo, there's a lot of cities out there that spend a lot of effort on making their, and the US government in general spends a lot of effort making data available to the public. Sometimes it's easy to understand, sometimes it's not, but this is the LA City webpage. They have 4 categories, and under a safe city you can find all sorts of different data about traffic collisions, about arrests, that are quite rich and quite complex and quite interesting to explore. So there's bound to be something that is of interest to a student. Another thing I like to do a lot of things on is the American Time Use Survey. So this comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's a really unusual survey. They randomly, it's a random sample of residents in the US, and they're randomly sampled on a particularly randomly sampled day. So the days and the people are chosen randomly. And through a lengthy interview process, they try to reconstruct what happened to them in the previous day and convert that into how much time was spent doing various activities. So I have a next slide of some examples of activities. This is kind of another, I don't know, if you probably can't read the variables down the left, but I summarize them there. So they're demographic variables about age and gender, etc. And then they're, basically how many minutes were spent working in education, playing sports, volunteering, practicing religion, food. I'm not quite sure what that entails, sleep, and so on. So what I'd like to do is just a little think, pair, share here, and give you about a minute to come up with a question that you would ask of these data, something that these would prompt you to be curious about. And share with your partner. There's a hostile act I'll randomly choose you there. Sure.
Yeah, actually, what I would like is like, so we gather this data, and what I teach is the statistics. My thing is that you don't just gather data, you want to know things, which is valuable, but you want to do something with the data gathered, because you have a question, you want to put that into action based on the information you get. And one of the things that's important to me is this correlation, not just like, yeah.
Well, I guess what I'd add to that is you may want to put things into action, or it may be enough to know something. I mean, so like what this data set is about is it's a way of trying to estimate the value of activities in the economy that don't earn money necessarily. And so it may be enough to just describe what those activities are and how they're happening.
Oh, just a small one. How many close friends does someone talk to in a day? Based on
Okay,
data?
how many close friends do you talk to in a day?
Albert and I said, how often do you talk on your cell phone?
How often are you talking on your cell phone? So how much time is spent talking on a cell phone? Yes?
How is your sleep related to the number of kids you have?
How is your sleep related? Let's just look at that one. I have another one prepared.
Less sleep, more kids.
Okay, we have a prediction. So I just want to point out, we've just done 2 stages of the data cycle. We've considered the data, and our consideration here was very superficial because of the constraints of the class. And we've asked some questions. So now we're going to go to the analysis phase, and to analyze it, I'm just going to choose an histogram.
Well, you're in a different data set.
Oh, I am, yeah, so I'm looking at number of children, so I'm going to look at, let's do a scatter plot. And I want to do number of children, household kids, and sleep. A little hard to make sense of.
Is it the more kids you have, the less sleep you get?
We could put on.
The less sleep you get. Is that what it says? That's how I would interpret it.
Oh, I
Zero sleep? That's an hour.
Oh, I'm sorry, let me undo this. Well, some people do get zero sleep. And your students will be among them.
Yes.
Some days.
Some days.
Let me put my glasses on. I'm looking for the regression line to overlay. Maybe I just have to overlay it.
That was the one.
I guess it was.
So there's no question.
Well, the lines where they're flat. Any theories about what's going on here, or anything else you want to look at?
Like, more like the deviation.
Yeah, so who is in this data set? It's randomly chosen people, are those who you want to focus on in the study. If you have an idea that sleep, the number of kids is affecting sleep, might have a lot to do with how old you are, right? Some of these people may be kids themselves in the study. Right? So maybe the next, so we've done an analysis, we've done an interpretation, which is to kind of say, like, we don't see a relationship. So the next step is maybe to refine and say, maybe we can zoom in and just look at, people who are maybe women, maybe people who are older than 18, maybe people who are of childbearing years between 18 and 50 or something like that. And so there are ways that we might want to, in the next round, start to zoom in and ask more questions. So I asked a more trivial question, which was, do we tend to sleep longer on holidays? And there's my first stab, which says maybe just a little bit, but then box plots make it a lot more clear that holidays are on the right, so they're slightly more sleep, and the dispersion of the variability of sleep on non-holidays is kind of interesting. And again, we might want to refine that because non-holidays includes weekends, so maybe I wanted to change, should have asked, do we sleep longer on holidays and weekends or something like that? So I might have another round myself to look at that. All right, so item number 5. So we've covered the 3 most important things, so if the topics now are fine. But just some extra things. One is you can do a lot without inference, and some of that stuff is really hard, and we've just seen an example of that. We got a long ways on our own on this last question, and we posed some possible investigations in the future, and we haven't yet asked any questions that are inferentially related. So we can do a lot, and And some of that thinking is hard, especially if you're wrestling with the data itself and trying to understand what's there, without inference. But even before you get to inference, it's a good idea to start prompting people to think about inference. So, I mean, I wondered how much sleep I get on the holidays, but the next thing is that difference due to chance? And I wonder if it extends, how far can I extend it? To other ages, to other countries, to other, So when we're teaching inference, we get really hung up on the assumptions. Is this a random sample? But before those assumptions come along, there are actual questions we need to wrestle with, like who does this extend to? And these are really important questions now because most of the data that we're going to find online are not random samples. So the crime statistic data I showed you a few slides back from the LAPD, that's not a random sample of crimes. That is, unfortunately, all of the crimes. So what I learned from that inference question, what else does this apply to, is a hard, tough question and needs to be wrestled with. And hopefully they'll say, they'll learn then when they learn about confidence intervals that maybe you don't want a confidence interval on something where it doesn't really extend to any other population. And there are other cases where inference is not even really possible. And so this is an example. This is from a website called Dollar Street. And if any of you know the Hans Rosling Gapminder, this is his daughter and son project. And I bring it up because one of the things we wrestle with now is when I was a student, data meant numbers. But data means so much more now. And one way data come to us is in pictures. What this website does is they visit homes all over the world and they take pictures of things. And they represent them, the house, that the household is given a number that kind of represents their income in terms of US dollars. And this is the street they live on, and here's the lowest price, and here's the highest price. And you can kind of click around and explore the data in various ways and pose hypotheses about things and try and get a sense by looking at pictures of how lifestyles vary about the world. And one of the messages that comes through, not completely clear, one of the messages is that the standard of living, the sorts of things you do, depend a lot more on your income than where you live. So wealthy people live kind of the same all over the world, and poor people live kind of the same all over the world, with some small differences. This, what you're seeing here, is one of the variables of what do they plan to purchase next. So you see beddings, you see something I don't know what it is, you see air conditioners, refrigerators, cars, looks like a battery and yeah. So this is a really fun website I encourage you to look at. Here's some other variables to look at. What people's hands looks like, what the floors look like, how they brush their teeth, what their toilet looks like. I mean, so it really gets into interesting variables that people want to know more about. And again, you can't apply inference to this, but you can apply statistical thinking in trying to pose questions and answer the questions and support your answers with the data that you have and question the limits of that data. Okay, number 6. I'm going to go through the last two quickly so we wrap up soon. Data moves. My friend and colleague Tim Erickson came up with this term. These are basic actions you can take on data. Some of this is a little advanced for intro stats, but basically they're things that students are kind of thinking of anyway sometimes, and it's extraordinarily helpful sometimes just to give them names. And the first two are really the most important, I think. Transform, create a new variable from old ones. So when I looked at the time use data, there was no variable that said holiday. I had to create that by saying I have the dates at which the data were collected. I can look them up and see if a holiday occurred there. If it did, I put a 1. If it didn't, I put a 0. Students will measure things in inches, but now they want to compare it to something measured in centimeters. Or the times are given in minutes, but they want them in hours. There are all sorts of reasons why you might want to transform a variable. And it's good for students to know how to do that, and then to act on it. And the other one that's really helpful, they're all helpful, but this is really helpful, is the filter one. And this just means often we want to examine a subset of the data. And a great example is this discussion about sleep and children. We started out with looking at everyone, and then we kind of decided maybe we need to filter out some ages, maybe we need to filter out some genders, maybe there are other things we want to filter out. So it's just a tool for helping us decide what we really want to focus on. And these tools come hand in hand with the questions. So the questions that students are answering are related to actions that they're going to be taking. So as I'm filtering, I'm changing and refining my question to apply to a different group of people than maybe I started with. 7, I'm going to go over really fast because there's not much time. But if you find yourself with one of those kind of, maybe an extra project or students who want to go further, or just extra time, teach them about classification and regression trees. Why? They're a really cool thing. They're unusual in statistics, or they're less unusual now, but unusual in traditional statistics, because it's not a mathematical model, it's purely algorithmic. And yet it generates lots of mathematical thoughts and questions. They're used for classification and regression, I guess the name says that. I'll just give you a quick little overview of how they might be used. These are a random set of football and soccer players. And if we had more time, I'd ask you to tell me a rule that I might use so that given these data, I could classify, I could tell if they belong to play football or soccer. So for example, I might look at the weight and say, if you're less than this amount, I'll classify you as soccer, and if you're bigger, I'll classify you. And so you come up with a rule. Do this with my class, and it works, doesn't take too long. And then I'm going to give you some data that doesn't have those labels, new data, and you apply your rule to these data. And you can grade yourself and see how well you did. Usually you don't get 100%. So what classification regression trees is they do just that. They come up with the rules for you. If you want to be mathematical, it's basically producing a piecewise nonlinear regression. But basically you read this tree, it's really easy to interpret. If the player's weight is more than 198, we go to the left. The left says if their weight is more than 220, we go down here and we classify as an NFL player. And we got 5 out of 5 correct there. If their weight is smaller than 198, we classify as soccer. We got 7 out of 7 correct in that particular instance. The way this algorithm works is really cool. I'd like to think if you thought about it, you might come up with it. I'll just spend a moment telling you because it's really cool. It's a rare example of elegant brute force. What it does is it takes, we have like 5 variables. It sorts them in order. It takes the person who the smallest weight, and it says, I'm going to classify everyone who's less than or equal to this weight as soccer and greater than as football. And it sees how many it gets correct. Then it moves to the next weight, and it does the same sort of split and sees how many it gets correct. Then it flips the 2 and says, what if I classified the other way, how many would? And then it does that for every single variable and every single value. And when it's done, it knows which split is the best. And if there's a tie, you have to toss a coin or something like that. And then that produces this first split. And then you repeat. It's a recursive algorithm, so you repeat it at each stage. So it's not hard to understand. We have our high school kids act it out in a geometry tree they perform in class, and it leads to something that is it's one of the fundamental pieces of a lot of machine learning algorithms. So it kind of has a lot of traction that carries forward. And some kids, some don't. Some find it really cool. It's something different, and solves problems that are classification problems, not what they're used to thinking about. Last thing is to ask hard questions. So. Why ask hard questions? Because we know all of our students think all of our questions are hard. But I just want to pose it as an idea. Asking really hard questions is a way of allowing students, maybe in a project context, to exercise creativity. So an example that was posed to me this summer that I was really fascinated with is particle matter increasing? Is particle matter pollution getting worse? PM10 refers to small particles that are below a certain size, and they get into your lungs and they cause damage to the lungs. And there's data on this, and if you go to the data, that's not what I wanted to have happen. That's actually the data, but if you go to the data, you'll see that there's lots of different choices, and you're going to see, they're each organized by year. And so I want to know if it's getting worse, how many years do I have to work with? You'll notice that the smallest is 20,000 rows, 18,000 rows. So they're big data sets, so do I really want to look at all the years? And if so, how? And if you delve into one of these files further, you're going to say, wow, first of all, they're giving me 5 or 6 or 7 different measures of PM10. the minutes, the smallest measured in the day, the greatest measured in the day, the average of the day, various other ways of parsing that. And they've got multiple measurements at multiple sites, so what does it mean to say it's increasing? It could be going up at one site and down at another. So there's a lot to wrestle with. By the way, I mean, another really simple and hard question is, how much did it rain last year? You're confronted with the same issues, and it turns out to be an extremely creative question to address, because students have to make decisions about, oh, what do I mean by how much it rained? And where? Because you've got all these different monitoring stations. Some are close together, some are far apart. So students have to make hard decisions, and they may be good decisions, they may be bad decisions. Doesn't matter. They have to make decisions, and they can kind of talk about what those decisions are. So one last plug, as an example of hard problems, is DataFest. So this is an event I started a few years ago. Just say it's a weekend. They get together for a weekend. They're given a hard problem. They present their answers to judges, and the data come from various corporate and non-corporate sponsors. So example, last year it came from the Canadian National Women's Rugby Team. The rugby players wear sensors on their back, so during games and practices, we know everything, where they're moving and how fast. They have daily health check-ins, and they have daily medical reports and workouts. And they asked us, what can we say about the role fatigue plays in winning games or losing games? And so it's a very vague question, and that's deliberate because it lets students at different levels choose which piece they want to tackle. So beginning students might just say, let's make a good picture of what fatigue looks like for this player, or something like that. That can be very narrow. There are two events in Southern California, one at UCLA, which I run, and one at Chapman, which Michael Fahey runs. You're welcome to contact either one of us if you think you have students who want to go. They have to go as a team. You're all welcome to come and visit either one just to see what's happening. They're a lot of fun. It's kind of surprising. The students stay all night long. This is my favorite picture because they're pulling. Last year at Chapman, the winners of the best use of external data were from Orange Coast College. And the best visualization teams were from UCI, but they formed a team of transfer students from local. I don't know, they were from three different two-year colleges around UC Irvine. So there's a lot. We want to encourage as many two-year students as possible. And again, it's not to win. We tell students you're not here to win, you're here to learn something and kind of be challenged, and to network with all the other people around you and learn more. So those are the 8 steps. Like I said, I haven't been successful at my secret learning outcome, and the goal again isn't for me to be successful, but to keep trying. So I urge you all to keep trying. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Welcome any comments you have just through email.
Yeah, you all leave. 1 second of your time. Most of us here are